The year was 1923, and the Arizona desert held secrets buried deeper than any grave. This is the story of Jake Sullivan, a cattle rancher whose ordinary morning became an extraordinary mystery that would change everything he thought he knew about his past. Drop a comment below and let us know which city you're watching from. The discovery. Jake Sullivan guided his horse across the familiar desert terrain, checking water wells on his ranch. At 38, he had worked this harsh Arizona land for 15 years, building a modest but successful cattle operation. The morning sun beat down mercilessly as he approached the eastern boundary of his property. Something glinted in the distance near an old abandoned mine shaft. As Jake rode closer, his blood ran cold. Partially buried in the sandy soil was an ornate wooden coffin, its brass fittings polished to a shine despite being weathered by desert winds. Dismounting carefully, Jake approached with the wariness of a man who had learned that the desert held many secrets. The coffin was small, child-sized. Someone had buried a baby out here, far from any cemetery. With trembling hands, Jake lifted the heavy wooden lid. Inside, wrapped in yellowed linen, was the perfectly preserved body of an infant. The dry desert air had mummified the tiny form in a way that was both miraculous and deeply unsettling. But what he saw next made his knees buckle. Engraved on a brass plate inside the coffin lid were the words, "Jacob Michael Sullivan, beloved son, born April 12, 1885, called home too soon." Jake stared at the inscription, his mind reeling. April 12, 1885, that was his birthday. Jacob Michael Sullivan, that was his name, but he was very much alive, standing in the desert sun, not lying in this tiny coffin. "What the hell?" he whispered. Jake examined the coffin more closely. The craftsmanship was exceptional, expensive work that would have cost a fortune. The brass plate was genuine, the engraving deep and professional. This wasn't a prank. Someone had gone to great expense to create this burial. But who and why? And if this coffin was supposed to contain his body, how was he standing here looking at it? Jake's adoptive parents, Patrick and Mary O'Connor, had told him his birth parents died in a wagon accident when he was 6 months old. They found him at the territorial orphanage and raised him with love. It was a story he had never questioned. Now, staring at this impossible coffin, Jake wondered if everything he'd been told was a lie. He carefully closed the coffin and looked around for clues. The ground showed signs of recent disturbance, as if someone had deliberately uncovered it after decades of burial. But there were no footprints, no tracks, nothing to indicate who might have done this. Someone had wanted him to find this. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to make sure Jake Sullivan would discover the coffin bearing his name. Jake rode hard back to the ranch house, his mind churning with questions. The familiar landscape that had always brought comfort now seemed alien and threatening. His foreman, Carlos Mendez, was in the barn when Jake arrived. Carlos was in his 50s, weathered by decades of ranch work, with sharp, dark eyes that immediately showed concern at Jake's obvious distress. "Boss, what's wrong?" Carlos asked. "Carlos, I need to ask you something. What do you remember about how I came to live with the O'Connors?" Carlos's expression grew guarded. "You were very young. Your parents died in an accident. Senor Patrick and Senora Mary brought you home from the orphanage. That's the story I've been told, but you were here then. What do you actually remember?" The older man was quiet for a long moment, as if weighing decades of carefully kept secrets. "Boss, there are some things better left buried." "Not anymore," Jake said firmly. He described his discovery of the coffin, watching Carlos's face grow pale. "Dios mío," Carlos whispered, crossing himself. "I hoped this day would never come." "You know something about this?" Carlos nodded slowly. "See, boss, your real father wasn't some poor settler. He was Richard Sullivan, one of the richest men in the territory. Silver mines, cattle ranches, businesses everywhere." Jake felt the world tilt. If my father was rich, why was I in an orphanage? Because someone wanted you dead, boss. Someone who stood to inherit everything if Richard Sullivan had no heir. The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. Someone tried to kill me as a baby. They thought they succeeded. That coffin, it was meant to be your real grave. Shadows of the past. The next morning, Jake sat in his study surrounded by papers Carlos had helped him gather. The older man had proven to be a treasure trove of information about the Sullivan family and the events of 1885. "Here, boss," Carlos said, spreading out a yellowed newspaper clipping. "Tucson Daily Star, September 15th, 1885. Jake read aloud. "Tragic fire claims life of infant heir to Sullivan fortune." The article described how baby Jacob Sullivan had perished in a house fire, leaving Marcus Sullivan as sole heir to his brother's vast estate. A house fire, Jake mused, not a wagon accident. They had to change the story. Too many people knew about the fire, but here, far from the city, they could tell a different tale. Carlos showed Jake a hand-drawn map of Sullivan properties throughout the territory. The scope was staggering. Mines, ranches, businesses stretching from Mexico to Colorado. Marcus controls all this now. See, the Silver Crown Mine, the largest producer in Arizona. The Sullivan Cattle Company, real estate, banks, even newspapers. He used your inheritance to build an empire, built on my supposed death. Before Jake could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 6 riders were heading toward the ranch, led by a well-dressed man on a magnificent black stallion. "Dios mío," Carlos whispered. "That's Marcus Sullivan." Jake felt his blood turn to ice. "He's here. How could he know already?" They stepped onto the porch as the riders stopped in the yard. Marcus Sullivan dismounted with fluid grace. He was tall and lean, with silver hair and piercing grey eyes. His expensive clothing spoke of wealth and authority. "Mr. Sullivan," Marcus called out. "Jacob Sullivan, I presume." "That's right," Jake replied evenly. "And you are?" Marcus smiled coldly. "I'm your uncle Jacob, Marcus Sullivan. I believe we have much to discuss." Jake kept his voice steady despite the adrenaline. "I wasn't aware I had any living relatives." "Oh, but you do." Marcus pulled out a folded document. "I have here a birth certificate from 1885. It shows that Richard Sullivan and Catherine Walsh had a son named Jacob Michael Sullivan, born April 12, 1885. What does that have to do with me?" "That's fascinating." Marcus pulled out a photograph showing the coffin Jake had discovered, opened to reveal its empty interior and nameplate. "Someone sent me this yesterday, a coffin supposedly containing baby Jacob Sullivan's remains. But it's empty, Jacob, completely empty." Jake felt the trap closing. "I don't understand what you're getting at." "I think you understand perfectly. Someone faked that baby's death and spirited him away. Someone who knew I would inherit if my brother's heir was dead. That's quite a story." Marcus's voice hardened. "We both know who you really are. The question is what we're going to do about it." Carlos stepped forward. "Senor, perhaps you should state your business plainly." Marcus's eyes fixed on the foreman. "Ah, Carlos Mendez. You worked for my brother, didn't you? Disappeared right around the time of the fire. I work for Senor Sullivan now. Here's what's happening, nephew. You're coming with me to Tucson for a conversation about your past and future. My associates will ensure you don't get foolish ideas about running." Jake's hand moved toward his gun. "And if I refuse, then there might be an unfortunate accident. Desert bandits, perhaps, or maybe a fire like the one that was supposed to have claimed your life 38 years ago." Before Jake could respond, another rider approached from the east, a woman in practical riding clothes on a paint horse, riding with expert skill. She appeared to be in her 60s, with silver-streaked black hair and intelligent dark eyes. "Elena," Carlos whispered. Marcus went white. "That's impossible. Elena Vasquez died in the fire." The woman smiled grimly. "Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated, Marcus, just like reports of young Jacob's death." Elena dismounted and walked toward them confidently. "Hello, Jacob. You've grown into a fine man. Your father would be proud." Jake felt emotion surge at meeting someone who had known his real parents. "Elena, Carlos told me about you. I've been watching over you from a distance all these years, mijo, making sure you stayed safe until you could handle the truth." Marcus's voice was tight with rage. You sent me that photograph. You dug up that coffin. I did. Because it was time for the truth, time for Jacob to claim what's rightfully his, and time for you to pay for your crimes. He'll never live to claim anything, Marcus snarled, reaching for his gun. I wouldn't, Elena said calmly. I didn't come alone. Armed men began appearing from cover around the ranch. Jake counted at least a dozen, all with rifles trained on Marcus and his men. You see, I've spent 38 years preparing for this day. Building alliances, gathering evidence, making sure justice would finally be served. Marcus looked around at the surrounding men, his face a mask of fury. This isn't over, Elena. I have resources you can't imagine. Yes, you do, but I have something more powerful. The truth, and after 38 years of silence, I'm ready to tell it. The truth revealed the tension in the ranch yard was thick as Elena faced the man who had tried to murder the baby she had helped raise. Marcus's gunmen sat uneasily, aware of the rifles trained on them from multiple directions. Lower your weapons, Elena called to her allies, but keep them ready. Jake watched in amazement as the armed men emerged fully from concealment. They were a diverse group, Mexican vaqueros, Anglo cowboys, former soldiers, all shared grim determination and obvious loyalty to Elena. Who are these men? Jake asked. People wronged by Marcus Sullivan over the years. Men who lost jobs, land, families because of his greed. They've been waiting for justice. Marcus's voice dripped contempt. A collection of malcontents and failures. They can stand for what's right, Elena shot back. Something you've never understood, Marcus. Jake stepped forward. Elena, I need to know exactly what happened that night in 1885. All of it. Elena nodded, her eyes reflecting old pain. Very well, mijo. It's time you knew the whole truth. They moved to the porch shade, Marcus and his men dismounting under the watchful eyes of Elena's allies. Your father, Richard Sullivan, was a good man, Elena began. He built his fortune through hard work and fair dealing, but Marcus was always jealous, always looking for shortcuts. That's a lie, Marcus interjected. Richard was weak. He let sentiment cloud his judgment. Richard was honorable, Elena continued. When your mother, Catherine, died giving birth to you, he was heartbroken. But he poured all his love into raising you. You were the light of his life. Jake felt deep ache, mourning the father he'd never known. What happened to him? He died 6 months after you were born. A riding accident, they said. But I always suspected Marcus had a hand in it. Marcus's face remained impassive, but Jake caught a flicker of something in his grey eyes. After Richard's death, Marcus became your guardian. But the will was specific. Everything would go to you at 21. Marcus would only be caretaker. So he decided to eliminate the heir, Jake said grimly. Sigh, he hired 3 men to kill you, but Patrick O'Connor suspected something. He had been Richard's foreman and knew Marcus's character. Carlos stepped forward. I was there that night, boss. Senor Patrick said we had to act quickly. He had heard rumors. Seen Marcus meeting with dangerous men. Elena nodded. Patrick devised a plan. We would fake your death and spirit you to safety. But we needed a body for the coffin. What did you use? Jake asked. A stillborn calf. We wrapped it in baby clothes and burned it beyond recognition. It was horrible, but it was the only way to save your life. Marcus laughed bitterly. Very clever. It worked for 38 years. Elena reached into her saddlebags and pulled out a leather portfolio. I didn't spend these years just hiding. I gathered evidence. She spread documents on a small table. Here's Richard's original will. Here are bank records showing how you've looted the estate, Marcus. And here, she pulled out a final document, is a signed confession from one of the men you hired. Marcus went pale. That's impossible. They're all dead. 2 are dead. But Jake Morrison lived until last year. Before he died, he told his priest everything. Jake examined the confession, hands shaking as he read the detailed account of the plot to murder him. Marcus had paid 3 men $500 each to kill the baby and burn the nursery. This is enough to hang you, Marcus, Elena said quietly. Marcus's composure cracked. You think anyone will believe a dead criminal and an old Mexican woman? I have judges, politicians in my pocket. Ah, do you? Because I've already sent copies to the Territorial Attorney General, Federal Marshal, and 3 newspapers. By tomorrow, this will be front-page news. Marcus's face drained of color as he realized the trap constructed around him over decades. There's more, Elena continued, pulling out another thick folder. Evidence of your other crimes. Miners killed for organizing unions. Ranchers driven off their land. Politicians bribed. Judges corrupted. Jake looked at Marcus with disgust and pity. Why? You were already wealthy. Why steal my inheritance? Marcus's mask slipped completely. Because it should have been mine. I was the older brother. I worked just as hard, but Richard got all the credit, success, respect. When he died, I finally had a chance to claim what was rightfully mine. By murdering a baby, by doing what was necessary, you were just a squalling infant. I could have used that wealth to build something great. The casual callousness hit Jake like a physical blow. This man had been willing to murder a helpless baby out of greed and jealousy. I know now, Jake said quietly, and I want it back, all of it. Marcus laughed harshly. You'll never see a penny. I'll tie this up in courts for years. He was interrupted by approaching horses. About 20 riders, led by a man wearing a federal marshal's badge, rode into the yard. That would be Marshal Davidson, Elena said with satisfaction. I sent him a telegram yesterday. Marshal Davidson was tall and lean with graying hair, and the steady gaze of someone accustomed to dangerous criminals. Mr. Marcus Sullivan, I am. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, embezzlement, bribery, and other charges. Marcus's gunmen started to reach for weapons, but found themselves facing Elena's men and the marshal's deputies. After a tense moment, they raised their hands in surrender. As Marcus was shackled, he turned to Jake with pure hatred. This isn't over, boy. I have friends you can't imagine. I'll be out before the week's over, and when I am, I'll finish what I started. No, Jake said quietly. You won't. He turned to Elena. You said you have evidence of other crimes. How much? Enough to bring down half the territorial government. I've been very thorough, mijo. Jake nodded grimly. Then we're going to use it. All of it. We're going to expose every corrupt official, every crooked judge. We're going to clean house. Marshal Davidson looked interested. That's a tall order, son. You're talking about very powerful people. I'm talking about justice. My uncle spent 38 years building a criminal empire on my supposed death. It's time to tear it down and make sure everyone who helped him pays. Eleanor smiled proudly. Your father would be very proud, mijo. Richard always believed great wealth came with great responsibility. As Marcus was loaded into a prison wagon, Jake felt a strange mixture of emotions. Relief that the truth was out. Anger at decades of lies. But also determination to reclaim not just his inheritance, but his identity and rightful place. The sun was setting over the desert, painting the sky in brilliant orange and red that promised a new dawn. Jake Sullivan, the real Jacob Sullivan, stood on his porch, knowing his life was about to change in ways he could barely imagine. The boy, hidden away to save his life, had grown into a man capable of fighting for justice, not just for himself, but for everyone wronged by Marcus Sullivan's reign of corruption. The game that began with a baby's faked death was entering its final phase, and Jake Sullivan intended to win. Justice and redemption. 3 months later, Jake Sullivan stood in the marble lobby of the Sullivan Building in downtown Tucson, reading the brass plaque installed that morning. Sullivan Enterprises, Jacob M. Sullivan, President. The weight of those words still felt surreal after weeks of legal proceedings that had restored his identity and inheritance. The legal battles had been swift, aided by Elena's documentation and the federal government's desire to clean up territorial corruption. Marcus's network had crumbled like a house of cards, with judges, politicians, and business leaders scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. Marcus Sullivan was now serving life in territorial prison, his empire dismantled and ill-gotten gains returned to their rightful owner. The man who had tried to murder a baby for money had finally faced justice. "Senor Sullivan," Carlos's voice drew Jake from his contemplation. The older man approached across the polished floor, still uncomfortable in formal business attire, as the new general manager of Sullivan Enterprises. "The board meeting is ready," Carlos continued. "All department heads are assembled." Jake nodded and straightened his tie, still adjusting to formal requirements. The transition from rancher to business magnate had been challenging, but he had thrown himself into learning every aspect of his inherited empire. The conference room was filled with department heads who had once lived in fear of Marcus's unpredictable rages. Now they sat with relaxed confidence, knowing their contributions were valued. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jake began, "I have announcements that will affect our company's future direction." He opened a leather folder containing months of planning. First, the Sullivan Foundation will be established next month with a $2 million endowment. It will focus on education, healthcare, and economic development throughout Arizona territory. There were murmurs of approval. Jake had made clear he intended to use his wealth for community betterment, not just personal enrichment. Second, we're expanding into New Mexico and Colorado. But we'll do it right, through fair competition and honest dealing, not intimidation and corruption. Margaret O'Brien, head of real estate and one of the few who had maintained integrity during Marcus's reign, raised her hand. "Mr. Sullivan, what about properties acquired through questionable means?" Jake had expected this. "We're going to make it right, Margaret. Every property obtained through fraud will be returned to rightful owners or fair compensation paid. It'll cost us short-term, but it's right, and I believe it'll benefit us long-term by establishing our reputation for honest dealing." The meeting continued for another hour. When it concluded, Jake remained with Carlos and Elena, who had become his most trusted advisors. "The newspaper wants another interview," Elena said, holding up a telegram. "Your story has captured public imagination nationwide. They're calling it the greatest mystery of the American West." Jake grimaced. The media coverage had been intense, with newspapers from New York to San Francisco picking up the story. While publicity had helped expose territorial corruption, Jake found the attention uncomfortable. "Tell them no. We've said everything that needs saying." Elena smiled. "You're becoming quite the recluse, mijo. Perhaps it's time you thought about settling down, starting a family. You're wealthy now, and many young women would be honored to be your wife." Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks. There had been no shortage of interested young women, but he'd been too focused on his new responsibilities. "There is someone," Carlos said with a sly grin. "That school teacher from Tombstone, Miss Sarah Martinez. She's been writing regularly, and unless I'm mistaken, you've been writing back just as often." Jake had indeed been corresponding with Sarah Martinez, who taught at the school Elena had helped establish with money Jake provided for community improvements. Sarah was intelligent, compassionate, and refreshingly uninterested in his wealth. Their letters had grown increasingly personal, and Jake found himself looking forward to her correspondence more than any business meeting. "Perhaps it's time you visited her," Eleanor suggested gently. "In person, not just through letters." Before Jake could respond, there was a knock. His secretary entered with a concerned expression. "Mr. Sullivan, there's a gentleman here. He says it's urgent and concerns your uncle." Jake felt apprehension. "What about my uncle?" "He says Marcus Sullivan has escaped from prison." The room fell silent, comfortable atmosphere replaced by tension. Jake had been expecting this. Marcus had too many connections for his imprisonment to be permanent. "Send him in," Jake said grimly, his hand moving toward the gun he still wore. Deputy Marshal Frank Morrison entered, weathered and grave. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm afraid I have bad news. Your uncle escaped 3 days ago during prisoner transfer. We believe he had inside help. Guards still loyal to him. Any idea where he went?" "We're checking old hideouts, but he's disappeared. But, sir, I must warn you, before escaping, he made threats against your life. Several prisoners reported he talked constantly about revenge." Jake felt Carlos and Elena tense beside him. "What security do you recommend?" Full protection, sir. Armed guards, restricted movement. This man has nothing left to lose and blames you for destroying his empire. Jake considered carefully. He could hide behind bodyguards and live in fear, or take a more proactive approach that would end the threat once and for all. Deputy Morrison, I appreciate your warning, but I'm not going to live looking over my shoulder. Instead, I want to make Marcus an offer. Sir? Jake walked to the window, looking out at Tucson's bustling streets. Send word through whatever channels you have. Tell Marcus I'll meet him alone at the old mine shaft where this began, tomorrow at sunset. Boss, no! Carlos protested. It's too dangerous. It's the only way to end this. Marcus will never stop hunting me. He'll spend his life trying to get revenge, and innocent people might get hurt. But if I face him directly, on my terms, maybe we can settle this once and for all. Eleanor studied Jake's face shrewdly. You have a plan, don't you, mijo? Jake smiled grimly. I have an idea, but it'll require preparation and help from people I trust. The next evening, as the sun began setting over the Arizona desert, Jake rode alone toward the abandoned mine shaft where he had discovered the coffin that changed his life. He was armed with his Colt, .45 and Winchester rifle, but counting on more than weapons. Marcus was waiting beside the mine shaft with a rifle, madness burning in his eyes. Months in prison had aged him considerably. His silver hair was white, his face gaunt and lined with bitterness. He looked like a man who had lost everything. "Hello, nephew," Marcus called out. "I wondered if you'd have the courage to come." "I'm here," Jake replied simply. "What do you want, Marcus?" "What I've always wanted. What should have been mine from the beginning. You've destroyed everything I built. Now I'm going to finish what I started 38 years ago." "You mean murder an innocent person for money?" "I mean claiming what's rightfully mine," Marcus screamed, his composure cracking. Marcus raised his rifle, but before he could fire, approaching horses filled the air. Within moments, the area was surrounded by mounted men, Deputy Marshal Morrison and federal deputies, along with Elena's loyal allies. "It's over, Marcus," Jake called out steadily. "Surrender now and you might live to see another sunrise." Marcus's face twisted with fury as he realized he'd been trapped, outmaneuvered just as Elena had done months earlier. "You set me up. I gave you a chance to surrender peacefully. You chose violence just like always." For a moment, Marcus seemed like he might give up. Then, with a roar of rage echoing across the desert, he swung his rifle toward Jake and fired. The shot went wide, and before Marcus could work the bolt, Jake's Colt was in his hand. The single shot echoed across the desert, and Marcus Sullivan fell beside the mine shaft where his brother's fortune had begun. As deputies secured the scene, Jake stood looking down at the man who had tried to kill him twice and stolen 38 years of his life. He felt no satisfaction, only deep sadness for the waste of a life consumed by jealousy and greed. "It's finished," Deputy Morrison said quietly. "Yes," Jake replied, holstering his gun and looking up at stars appearing in the darkening sky. "It's finished." 6 months later, Jake Sullivan stood on the porch of a beautiful house in Tombstone, watching his wife Sarah tend to the garden she had planted in their front yard. They had been married for 3 months in a ceremony that brought together people from all walks of life, former miners and wealthy businessmen, Mexican vaqueros and territorial officials, all united in celebration. The Sullivan Empire continued prospering under his leadership, but Jake had learned to delegate and trust others with day-to-day operations. He focused on the Foundation's work, expanding educational opportunities throughout the territory and building a life with Sarah grounded in love, respect, and shared values. Elena, now in her 70s but still sharp, had become like a grandmother to them both. She lived nearby and spent her days writing memoirs, a detailed account of events that shaped Arizona Territory's history. Carlos had proven an excellent business manager, and Jake had made him a full partner in several enterprises. The older man had brought his extended family up from Mexico, and they had settled happily in Tucson, where Carlos's grandchildren attended schools the Sullivan Foundation had helped establish. "Jake!" Sarah called from the garden. Come see what's blooming. Jake walked down and put his arms around his wife, marveling at how different his life had become. A year ago, he had been a simple cattle rancher with no knowledge of his true identity. Now he was one of the territory's wealthiest men, married to a wonderful woman, and using his resources to make a positive difference. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked quietly, leaning back against him as they watched the sunset. "The simple life you had before?" Jake considered seriously. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity. There was something peaceful about working with cattle, knowing exactly what needed doing each day. But I can't regret learning the truth about who I am, and I certainly can't regret meeting you." Sarah smiled and turned to face him. "Elena says you're thinking about running for territorial governor when Arizona becomes a state. The thought has crossed my mind. Arizona needs honest leadership as it transitions to statehood, and I have the resources to run an effective campaign. More importantly, I have the motivation to clean up remaining corruption and build a government that serves all people." "You'd have my support," Sarah said, her eyes shining with pride and love. "You'd make a wonderful governor. You've already shown you can take a corrupt system and transform it into something honest and beneficial." As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in brilliant orange and red that promised endless possibilities, Jake Sullivan reflected on the strange journey that brought him to this moment. A coffin discovered in the desert had revealed not just the truth about his past, but the path to his future. The baby, hidden away to save his life, had grown into a man capable of leadership, justice, and love. The inheritance stolen from him had been reclaimed. But more importantly, he had discovered his true identity and place in the world. The desert had given up its secrets, and Jacob Sullivan had found not just his birthright, but his destiny. The boy, saved by others' courage and sacrifice, had become a man who could save others in turn, using his wealth and influence to build a better future for everyone who called Arizona home. The mystery that began with an impossible discovery had ended with the most possible of outcomes: justice served, love found, and a life lived in service to others. In the end, that was the greatest inheritance of all. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. If this story captivated you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more amazing tales. Comment below and let us know which city you're watching from. We love connecting with our viewers worldwide.